Okay. Growing up, when did you recognize that there were differences in skin color? Did somebody tell you?
No, nobody told me, but back in the um, 1950s, we had a woman who came in and cleaned the house and did our ironing, and she was black. And so I knew there were people of different skin colors, but I didn't actually interact with them until probably around 1965 when I went to college, because then we had people of different ethnicities and skin color in school.
Did you ever confront any discrimination around you? Why or why not? Well, what was the results?
Fortunately, I have never had to confront that because, I'm Caucasian. And so I have been around people who've experienced it, and it always just made me really angry. Um, but I guess I'm from the generation that we started with segregation. I mean, the whites went to one school and blacks went to another school. And I lived in an area that really didn't have a Hispanic population, no Asian population. It was pretty much just whites and African Americans. But I know when I started being in, social situations where both or, multiple ethnicities were together, it just would really make me angry when people were shunned or, denied service, anything like that. It just really pissed me off, made me angry.
Did young people respond differently from the older community regarding race?
Yes. Yes. And, unfortunately, I was in school at the time of the Civil Rights Movement, with Martin Luther King and all that stuff was happening. And so I was right there. It was on the news every night, on TV. You just couldn't. It was really in the headlines every day, and then that was part of the whole social change that was happening in America. I mean, it was just becoming a whole different society and culture. And I think because it was just beginning to happen, it kind of took on a life of its own. It was not anything that we had seen before. It was a new kind of, I don't want to call it a revolution, but it was a new evolution in society. I don't know if that answers the question, but
Yeah. Um,
don't hesitate to ask me for more details if I'm not kind of answering the question that
okay.
you.
Were there any local discriminations, sit-ins that you remember or participated in?
I remember vividly that there were water fountains and bathrooms that had signs right on the door that said, whites only, and then there were others that said colored. So you were either white or colored, which was, it's amazing how far we've come, thank God. But yes, I do remember that. Now, participating, I was, a kid then, so I didn't really have a lot of control. But I can remember, people in restaurants, you couldn't, we only had white people in the restaurant, which until I got to high school, I never even thought anything of it, just because that was the only thing I knew. But then once I became aware and knew that that's what was happening, and in the 50s and early 60s, that's when they started integrating schools. So I never had kids in my class that were, of other, ethnicities, until I got to college.
Do you think the civil rights movement changed race relations in the United States? What progress has been made?
Well, I definitely think it made a change. It's because of the division, the segregation, by keeping people separated like that. It really was self-perpetuating. It just kept happening because that's the way it was, kind of all based in slavery and, that history. But then once we started integrating, and it was not just, black people, over the last several decades, we become, much more the melting pot where there, like here in California, it's a much higher Hispanic population. And, but in the East, when I lived in the East growing up, it was mainly African American people. And so what has been really fun, I've really enjoyed watching happen over the last 7 decades, because I'm just crossed the 70 mark. It has changed. It has improved. I think, unfortunately, what I've seen in the last few years, though, is with some of the political arguments and conflicts that are happening, there has been, especially in the last year, it's been really kind of scary to see some of the old attitudes really coming back to the fore. So I just, I can only hope that we have enough, courage, and we have enough, now we've got a more homogenous society, with, interracial marriages and families and, extended families that are just, different types, that we can keep moving forward. So, yes, I've seen changes. It was very encouraging, certainly in the 70s, to see the results of the civil rights movement as, that was happening. But it's concerning to see that we may be taking a step back, in the country. And there are different pockets it seems to be more prevalent. But, I'm hopeful that people will, and I see it in the, younger generation. People are much more open, like, people your age, Michael, and even in, the 20s and in their 30s, there's a whole, much more open attitude and less, kind of color blindness. So people are people, but I'm just, I'm sure that we will continue to, move forward, just because it's kind of like the big snowball rolling down the hill. I think there's so much change that's taken place. I don't think we can stop it now. Thank goodness. I mean, I feel like that's a good thing.
What segments of the population is victimized, oppressed today. Do you believe that the promise of equality has been fulfilled now?
Mm. Well, I would say that the segments of the population that are, targeted for discrimination now are, it's kind of localized. It depends on the area because in some cities you'll have, more of one race than another or culture. But I think we see a lot of the immigrants that are coming over now, especially targeted now, I think, are folks from the Middle East. Because after 9/11, everybody got, in a big panic, thinking, anyone from that part of the world was a terrorist. And, that's not true. So, and I see, being here in Southern California, I see a lot of focus put on, the Mexican population or people from South America who are trying to get into the United States. I feel like they're targeted here, locally.
Yeah.
But it's, it seems to be all over the country, and so different populations. So as far as race is concerned, I think that's, here I see it more with Hispanic and Middle Eastern people, in general. But the one thing I love about being in California is that right now my population is getting smaller and smaller. So there are less Caucasian people in California than there are Hispanic people, which, I think there's a lesson to be learned. And so California kind of is a leader in a lot of things around the country. So I think it's encouraging to be here because we're such a big state with such a huge population and now such a big economy. We're the 5th largest economy in the world. so we're influencers. I can only hope that keeps moving forward.
What is your understanding of the Black Lives Matter movement?
Black Lives Matter, as I understand it, is a result of a lot of the it's just really it's hard to explain how we've seen the police, who are supposed to be protecting everybody, there seems to be such a bias against and I'm just going to say it's non-white. It's anybody who's not white. That the assumption is, as soon as they see someone who's not like them and they make a movement, they shoot them. So it's just really scary that the police force has gotten so, in some cases, out of control. And so I think that the Black Lives Matter movement has been kind of a rising up of those people who feel like they're really singled out and targeted. So that's it. And I know that then there's the, then of course the Blue Lives Matter was like, the police force saying, well, we matter too, because there are instances where, people on the police force are targeted and killed, but the percentages, the numbers are much higher on the other side of the scale, where we have police shootings for unarmed, you know, people who are, just out on a Saturday evening, or, they're walking down the street doing nothing. And so that's what I think the Black Lives Matter movement is kind of bringing that message to keep it in front of everybody's consciousness, like to make everybody aware.
Yeah. What was the greatest accomplishment of the civil rights movement?
Wow, the greatest accomplishment. How can I put it into words? I think the first step was the integration of schools, transportation, buses, trains. Everybody could sit wherever they wanted to sit. Restaurants where, everybody could go in and be served. And then I think it has, it's just a, it's kind of an example of the change in people's minds that everyone's equal. I'm not sure we're 100% there. I don't think we are. But I think that was the biggest outcome of the civil rights movement, was making that awareness for people who were pretty unconscious. Yeah. So I guess that would be the biggest thing, is the awareness and the kind of that whole tenet that's part of our heritage in our Constitution, that everybody's equal.
What was the greatest failure of the civil rights movement? In your opinion, what else can be done to improve civil rights issues?
Well, I don't know. The shortcoming, I guess, was that it was kind of a limited focus. It seemed to be centered around kind of the marches and the protests and the civil disobedience that Martin Luther King was promoting. It really was encompassing the people who believed that. And then what happened was you had fringe groups, especially in the late 60s, who were much more radical. And so I don't think they were included in the approach of civil disobedience. We had the Black Panther movement, and there were all kinds of other fringe groups who weren't patient. They were not willing to wait. They were going to do what they needed to do to get equality then. So there was violence, and so I think that I don't know how to solve it. I certainly don't know what the solution is, but I think there needs to be a more inclusive approach. So it's across all of the races, communities, social strata, everything that we have in the United States, which is now even more than it was, in the 50s and 60s. So, like I say, I don't know what the answer is, other than just really getting support from, locally, in our local government, and hopefully then that will flow up to the federal government, so that the whole country can be equal.
What are your thoughts on the bus boycott?
The bus boycott, I think we're going back to Rosa Parks. Is that okay? Um, I really always just was uh, I don't know. I think because it just really never made sense to me on a human level. I could never quite understand why, one person would um, sit in the front seat and somebody had to go all the way to the back just so that you were separated. Um, I have always supported the integration. So, my viewpoint is that I thought it was great. And I don't know whether it would help you, but must have been back in January when I was in Washington, D.C., I went to the African American Museum, and they have such good exhibits there that really showed, like they have a train car and with the signs on it, colored here, white here, and the lunch counters and all the different places where discrimination was happening. It just really makes it so much more real, and especially now that we're 50 years forward, it kind of takes you back. So I've always supported the that whole integration movement as it was happening, and so I just feel like it was overall, I feel like it's so unnecessary. I know that's kind of a simple way to say it, but the fact that they're singling out certain people and treating them differently just is not fair. I just don't support it at all.
What are your thoughts on women's struggle for equality, and do you think we still have that struggle today?
That's funny that you bring up the women's movement, because that was part of in the 1970s. That's where there was a lot of marches and things that I could relate to because I'm a woman. But I do feel like we still have especially the gender pay differences and how women are treated. Sometimes they're not treated equally in the workplace. I do think there's still a lot of room to improve, but it's so much better. I mean, you think back to when, women couldn't even vote. They were considered a man's property. So, you owned your wife, so to speak, and she couldn't vote, she couldn't own property. But then in the 70s when, women just said, we're not going to take it anymore, and took to the streets and marched, kind of like we're doing now for, gun violence in schools, it positions of power within companies, within the Congress, even on the local and state levels. You see women running for, the government positions. But I do think that there's inequality. So a woman doesn't get paid as much as a man for doing the same job. So I think we still have a ways to go, but we have made progress.
Well, that's all the questions.
All right.
So